I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Help me in welcoming Dr. Jack Gorman, who with his daughter Sarah have created an organization and written articles and also a book recently called Denying to the Grave, bold and refreshing ideas about the pathology that is climate change denial. Welcome, voice, Dr. Jack Gorman. All right, we're off to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And today I'm very excited to be talking with a person I've never met before. I had the opportunity to read a Psychology Today article from Jack Gorman, and I believe is it your spouse, Jack?
No, my daughter. My daughter.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So Jack and Sarah Gorman wrote this article that we're about to get into. I have been really wrestling, as many of the folks who have been watching this podcast for a while. I've been wrestling with the almost complete lack of presence of the mental health community in facing the collapse of human and earth systems that's going on, particularly climate change, and on top of that, climate change denial. And so it was just with great pleasure that I read what Jack and Sarah had put together in their, not just this article, but obviously a book that I hope we'll hear quite a bit about today as well, and obviously a major focus of their work. So Jack Gorman was professor and chair of psychiatry and professor of neuroscience at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and on the faculty of Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry for 25 years. He's a CEO and Chief Scientific Officer of Franklin Behavioral Health Consultants. He's co-author of Denying to the Grave, Why We Ignore the Facts That Will Save Us. That's the book I was talking about, along with his daughter, Sarah Gorman. His new book, Neuroscience at the Intersection of Mind and Brain, describes in accessible prose recent developments in neuroscience with special emphasis on how these findings relate to mental health, emotions, and psychotherapy. So, Jack, thank you so much for responding to my request to speak with you, and I hope I don't get too gushy about my enthusiasm for your article, but let me just give you a tiny bit of background, if I may. I've been speaking mostly with Lisa Van Susteren, is a mental health professional from DC that I've been speaking with mostly because we both have been involved with what's called the Transformational Resilience Alliance, and it's a small association who have really taken the neuroscience that I hear you are obviously so adept in, and many other self-regulation skills and so on, to bring those skills to the population that is either experiencing right now major disasters, stressors of extraordinary scale. And that distinction of transformational resilience, as opposed to just run-of-the-mill or everyday resilience we might talk about in terms of getting up after being knocked down. And one thing that Lisa Van Susteren and I have both talked about with great frustration is how, while there is some work going on to bring the mental health community into a position of relevance and getting ahead of the wave, which I still, in my judgment, they're behind the wave substantially. So it's again, it's just with great enthusiasm that I have you here. Want to hear about your book, want to hear about anything you'd like to say.
Sure.
That comes out of the article, because it is, well, in typical Psychology Today fashion, it's so very accessible. This is written for people, lay people like myself, and so I'm curious. Is it your experience that you are a rare bird, that you are a person in the mental health community of some prominence, I might add, that is taking a stand for really the pathology that is denial? That's one part of the article that I really like to get to. So way too much of my question and lead in. Thank you so much for being here. And where would you like to start out?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Let me start with the question that you just asked about whether I feel like a rare bird in all of this. And I will say that that's changing actually quite rapidly. You mentioned Lisa Van Susteren, for example, and she is one of the founders, as you know, of an organization called Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which I belong to as well. And that we're growing that membership, so there are more and more people. And we're very happy. I didn't work as hard on this as Lisa did, but several of the people have now gotten the American Psychiatric Association to agree to begin a process of divesting their portfolio from fossil fuel companies, as the American Medical Association has already agreed to do. And there's also a Climate Psychology Alliance as well. So there are a growing number of mental health professionals who are not just concerned about climate change, but also recognizing the role that mental health plays in all of this. For one thing, obviously, there's a concern that people will develop tremendous amounts of despair from this feeling that they're helpless, and that will become an object of concern for practicing mental health professionals as they do psychotherapy with their patients and clients. I also feel that we have to take a kind of population view, which is to try to understand what's behind the denial of climate change. And by that, we don't mean people who are iconoclastically denying that it exists. So we know that there are lots of politicians and corporate interests who will not agree that climate change is occurring. That's a motivated type of denial that is political, but rather we feel that there's a whole large body of people who actually do say, if you do, now when you do surveys, apparently a majority of Americans will endorse the fact that climate change is occurring, but that's pretty much it. They don't put it as a top priority. For example, if you ask people, what do you think are the major issues facing the country that you want to vote on? They'll list many other things, which are very important things. But when we point out that the way we're going with climate change, those things will often become moot for many of us if we're facing the climate disaster that many scientists think we are. That kind of denial, which we think is psychological, is something that I feel that mental health professionals and neuroscientists and people who are concerned and experts in behavior and the mind and brain need to address. And that's been a topic of ours for quite a while.
Well, if I could just stop you there. So I get the distinction, and I appreciate it. It all needs coverage, so I appreciate the kind of broader sweep that you're describing. And two questions about that. One is there any intention in any part of these organizations that you've just been describing, the psychiatric and psychological associations and so on, to is there anything going to be added in the DSM, whatever, 9 or
Right,
whatever?
right. Yeah,
Is there any intention to pathologize denial at the level of what is clearly ecocidal?
right.
You know, this is not, for me, it's quite a passionate
Yes,
and quite clear situation.
right.
And what's interesting, so there's one side of it is the I think you call it motivated
Right,
denial
right,
stance, which
right,
I think people should be in jail for personally. And then in this other, perhaps more benign, a bit more innocent somehow, maybe, there's a willful ignorance zone in the middle that I don't quite know how to peg it. But I'm wondering, is there a pathology there? And is there it would seem that there is something so intrinsic, so at all of our core, that nobody wants to talk about, that at the fabric of reality that we count on every day when we get out of bed and go to work, and it is right there,
right,
that is actually taking us down.
right.
And it's only in the deconstruction of that and the very delicate reconstruction to God knows what, that we will really have a chance at all.
Right.
So I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound
No,
lecturing.
I think you're asking very important questions. I'll just to start with the pathologizing thing. I think that some people, and we've talked about this at Climate Psychiatry Alliance, may recommend, and we're not there yet, but we may recommend that a future DSM not have a separate category for a illness, but rather a modifier saying, for example, that there are depression and anxiety disorders that are the result of climate change, meaning that concern, worry, despair over climate change produces those pathological situations. And also, I have to say that I think that the field of medicine in general is now recognizing that climate affects health, including mental health, in ways that people always knew about but didn't pay much attention to. So, for example, when we burn fossil fuels, we're also releasing all kinds of pollutants into the air on a regular basis that produce, we know, asthma and other kinds of lung disease, but probably also have an effect on the brain. There's early evidence that it may actually contribute to dementia, although I caution that that's not solid. But I think beyond that, you also mentioned a very important thing, which is that this is such a widespread phenomenon that rather than pathologizing it, we want to try to understand it as something that is occurring to people as part of human nature, not that that's an excuse, but that is not really pathological, but we want to understand it. And I think you put your finger right on it. It is so severe, so extreme, and so ubiquitous that there is going to be a natural tendency for people to want to turn away from it because they feel it's just too big to tackle. And that's why we started our article in Psychology Today by saying that psychologists and therapists and psychiatrists know what denial is, because that's a basic part of our work with most people who are needing help. But this is a denial of a scope that's much larger than we've ever faced before. It's denying that, as you said, that we're facing a catastrophe. And we haven't really dealt with that in that way before. So it's, I think, a new task for all of us in the mental health field to try to understand what we can do about something that is so huge. It's not simply an individual who is denying some aspect of their personality or their own history, which we can try to help them recognize and understand, but rather a whole population of people denying a terrible situation that's around them because it's so frightening that you just close your eyes, which is not an unusual or abnormal thing. We all do that to some extent, but is such a serious situation, one we have to try to do the best we can to overcome. I'm trying not to be hopeless about climate change. I think that my own understanding of the science is that we still have a shot at mitigating some of the worst effects if we're really bold about it. So I'm trying to keep that attitude. A lot of our thinking, like yours, as you were talking with me before we began, was motivated by 9/11. Because at the time I was working with a wonderful neuroscientist named Joseph Ledoux, who's at New York University, who I hope will win the Nobel Prize someday, who really has elucidated a whole new field of research, which is understanding how fear works in the brain. And we wrote an editorial, a little opinion piece in the American Journal of Psychiatry shortly after 9/11, where we looked at something called Pavlovian fear conditioning, which was the model that Joe uses in his lab. Very basically, what you do is you take a laboratory animal like a typical lab rat, and you play some loud tones, and rats are not afraid of loud tones, so they just look up and notice it. And then you give the rat a little, very mild electric shock right after one of the tones. And then with rats, they're very smart. After just one or two times like that, they'll freeze in place just by hearing the tone, even without the shock. So they've been conditioned. So that's the freezing part. But he's also shown that if you give the animal the opportunity to escape the shock, that the neural circuit that causes freezing is completely rerouted to a different part of the brain. And one of the brilliant things that Ledoux did was actually trace out the pathways that go for freezing and then this other way. So essentially what we said is that if you can give people a task, it reroutes the brain circuits so that they don't freeze. You have to give people a feeling that there's something they can do to prevent freezing. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in that is because we're often told that no individual can do that much about climate change. And it's true that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Essentially, we have to have a phase out of some of the largest corporations the world has ever known, have to stop, go out of business, essentially. That's an enormous task. So what is any individual who you say the only solution to what we are facing is for ExxonMobil and British Petroleum to stop doing what they do and for us to switch to sustainable energy? That's overwhelming. What if we say to those people, you need to change your light bulbs to LCD light bulbs, and you need to buy an electric car, and you need to do all of these individual things? Why would we do that, knowing that any one person changing their light bulbs is not going to prevent climate change?
Right.
And so our argument is, however, that if we give individuals tasks that they can actually accomplish, that will prevent people from freezing in place, make them feel that they have some capacity to be part of a solution, and therefore hopefully to create a large enough group of people to be a part of a massive political action to affect real climate change, which, as you know, is going to have to be done on a really political, national, international basis. So that was really one of the things that motivated us to write that article.
Got it. Yeah, and you state that really well. I appreciate that you included that. What I find fascinating, and I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the whole notion of reclaiming some amount of agency in, let's just keep talking about the USA, because
Sure.
we're pretty much at the top of the food chain and the consumption chain and the greenhouse gas chain.
Right.
Um, and ironically, I would suggest that we are just barely coming out of a decades-long nosedive of losing or forfeiting our agency and forfeiting our authentic ability to be a nation together in any considerable way. I'm wondering if you see any hopeful trends on the larger scale, or does it look as dismal to you as it does to me?
Well, again, I understand your pessimism, and there are lots of reasons to think that we're headed inevitably in a very bad direction. But I would also point out that so far every country in the world, except our country, has signed the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. So we know that there is international opinion and feeling for doing something about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we say about this country? I have to hope that this is a temporary aberration that we're in right now, where people who, again, I think political and economically motivated reasons are denying the existence of climate change and global warming. And we start to see some very creative people with this Green New Deal, for example, that's getting a lot of attention. And that's how these things start. As you know, they start with ideas that many people think are too way out to be embraced. Of course, the Green New Deal is extreme and is way out and is exactly what we have to do. Mm-hmm. There's no two ways about it. I mean, I've have friends who said, well, how about if we do everything that's proposed there except this, or how about if except that? And I say to them that this is not the kind of negotiation you're used to in the political arena. You can't negotiate with scientific reality. The scientific reality is that we're probably past the point where we can stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So we want to keep it below 2 degrees if we can. As you know, at 3.5 degrees, we're in for some horrible, horrible situations by the end of this century, and probably sooner. So those kinds of extreme measures that people are starting to put forward are exactly what we need to do. And I do see more and more movement toward people agitating for that. It's starting small. You know, I'm old enough to remember, for example, I was present at the very first Earth Day, and I was in college then. And what I remember back then is there was a small group of people, I wasn't even one of them at first, who felt the war in Vietnam was a immoral war. And we thought at first those people were way out and extreme, and you have to trust our government. And from those small people, people like me and many others got involved. And lo and behold, we were able to be effective in ending that war. So I am hoping that we can start with this, what seems to some people, many people, to be extreme, that we will be able to build on that people will actually jump on that. That's my hope.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I actually join you in more of your perspective than I might let on. If I could just shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
One of the main focuses I've had in putting together this body of work, hoping to put together kind of a toolbox that people can choose as needed. You know, how do I self-regulate in this extraordinary situation, and so on. One of the real, not just potholes, but just severe ravines and breaks in the road has been to look at the amount of communicating we don't do with each other. Let me say that a little less awkwardly. So the Yale has been doing for quite some time now a remarkable job of tracking climate communications, and both, you know, having that as a study that they do, and then also the work that they do in research. Excuse me. And depending on which poll I happen to be looking at from them and others, you know, roughly between 2/3 and 3/4 of the USA never talk with even their own dear loved ones about the subjects of consequence that you and I are talking about. They don't talk about it at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Even with the people that are close to them and that they aren't polarized from.
Right.
So I've had the pleasure in my many years now of having some pretty strong experiences of both extraordinarily functional work teams, where we really took the time to do the process work to keep ourselves at a very high level of kind of emotional and psychological and interpersonal hygiene, if you will, to keep us high functioning. And then also living in some shared living experiences with people that also were the exact opposite of what most people have, which is the roommate from hell, and nobody ever gets along, and their dirty socks on the TV, and, you know, whatever. The exact opposite of that. So very high functioning people living together. And it really breaks my heart to know that the average person doesn't have even a small portion of that. Most of us don't communicate well. And we've kind of gotten into this flow culturally as an entire nation. We've really jumped into the center of that river, and we're all flowing along.
Right.
And really showing extraordinarily little agency until recently. You know, I hear you, and it does do my heart good.
Right, right.
I'm wondering if you have anything to say what you've noticed.
Yes.
From your experience, especially given your profession.
Sure.
When you people watch and you notice the overall state of our ability to communicate with one another and to express ourselves in an authentic way, how does it look to you?
I think you're very, very accurate in your assessment that we have lost that ability. And I think you're also really emphasizing the critical nature of social groups in affecting any kind of change. I'll give you a personal anecdote and then some of the research on that. I bought an electric car, and I wrote an essay about this. It's on our Critica website, which I can tell you about later. But so I'm driving up to exchange my car. This is about a year ago, for this electric car. And I'm feeling extremely anxious. And I realized in the back of my mind was this kind of hope that something was going to go wrong with the deal, and that I was not going to be able to actually exchange the car. I was worried about how am I going to charge up this car? And am I really going to be able to handle it? But the other thing that I realized was that I didn't know anybody else in my social circle who had one of those cars. And so in essence, I was leaving the social group of people who own gas-powered cars for a brand new experience of feeling like I was the only person with an electric car. Now, obviously, I'm not the only person in the world who owns an electric car, but that's how it felt to me. I have since had this car. I've mastered the technology of charging it up. It's very easy. I recommend it to everybody. But the interesting thing that happened is I was at a meeting of a climate group when somebody I've known for many years said, "Oh, I have the same car." I didn't even know she had it. And I said, you know, we should actually use social media like everybody else does and start a social media group of all the people who have a Nissan Leaf is the particular car that we both have,
Yeah.
So that we don't feel so lonely. And maybe other people will listen in and maybe they'll feel stronger about doing this. It's unbelievably important to create social groups that have these kinds of things in mind. Dan Kahan, who's a wonderful law professor at Yale and a psychologist, wrote a recent essay about this phenomenon in which he points out that a person who has a transformation and decides, I really now believe in the importance of climate change. If that person belongs to a group that doesn't share that opinion, the person will feel as if there's very little that they can do to make a dent in climate change, but a lot they can do to alienate all of their friends. And so they will resist even allowing any information to come in that counteracts the group's opinion. And so we have to be much bolder at showing people that you can join a social group, you can have lots of friends who share this same concern and worry. I think you're doing a job with that, with your work right here, because you're using social media essentially. And, you know, many of us my age complain about social media all the time, and we have all these things about how people aren't talking to each other. But social media is a reality, and it's a tool that we can use, I think, to also bring people together. And so I think it's wonderful what you're doing, because I'm hopeful that this kind of effort will increase people's feelings that they're really not alone, that there are ways that they can have friends and colleagues and associates who share the same kind of feeling. And that is much more powerful than simply telling people the facts.
Yeah. Jack, would you say that author of that essay again?
His name is Dan Kahan, Kahan. He's at Yale. He's just a terrific scientist who's done a lot of work on why people harbor anti-science ideas and how you change people's minds and what social groups matter in this regard. So.
And can you remind me what I might look for in the title to find that particular paper?
I'm going to look it up right the minute we leave here, because I've just cited his work, and I'll give you the citation of
That's fine. Thank you. I'll be sure to post it on in the show notes after
terrific article.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Just to give you a little shorthand about this body of work that I put together in Living Resilience. In writing the book, The Impossible Conversation, I just kept asking the simplest possible question that I could to stay sane, because it was so much, literally my head was exploding just with learning how to learn about climate change so that I could vet the information. I mean, that was enough. That was a little mini college course that I put myself through. Not to mention getting to the point where I really took a deep dive into what is this thing denial and how long has it been going on and all that. This simple question that drove me first is what got us here? You know, actually the very first question is this truly a predicament? It's obviously a bunch of very vexing questions and problems and challenges. No question about that. But really the whole proposal that was laid out in the presentation that you know got the thing started was that we are also facing predicaments or dilemmas, things that don't seem to suggest any sort of solution. So once I did vet that, indeed, it looks to me like we have predicaments on our hands in addition to all that other stuff. Then the next question was, what got us here? And time after time, loop after loop, article after article, I kept coming back to, we've disconnected. We've disconnected from the primary sources of meaning in a human life, from our deeper selves, from our relationship with each other, and obviously with Earth. So again, just trying to keep it simple, trying to keep a framework that I could still keep my head around without, you know, exhausting myself, which, as I'm sure you know, it's a rabbit hole that can take the best of us down. Right. So really what made this work happen made, you know, I guess, I have never been a religious person at all. If anything, antagonistic toward religion of any kind. But ironically, in these past few years, the people that I've been able to have in-depth conversations with are people from often from a fundamentalist end of a religion or another. And the word that keeps coming up that describes a kind of an extraordinary state that I've been blessed with having a number of times in my life, completely unrelated to anything where you and I are talking about, just happen to have had these experiences. And it now turns out to be something that's extraordinarily fitting for facing this scale of predicament that we've got going on. And ironically, again, these fundamentalist folks, these people with a deeply religious framework with which to see life, they told me about their what they call grace, state of grace. And everything they described was yes, that's this expansiveness, this extraordinary, like limitless energy, and this remarkable sense of belonging and intimacy and expansion with both people and objects, animate and inanimate around me, and so on. So the work is based on reconnection. Just to give you the snapshot version of what I'm doing, is I'm offering people a menu to choose from so they can choose the practices that work for them, that when they look and assess how connected am I with my own inner wisdom, my own authentic, you know, core, how connected am I, what's the quality of my relatedness, do I have the ability to be in right relationship with people around me, and similarly with Earth. And so they kind of pick from the menu and take on practices, and we share that with one another.
Right.
So that's, I think, my or our version of something positive to reach for.
Right.
That I believe is closer to the existential level we're facing, you know, in the predicament.
Right.
It allows us to be a little bit more hands-on, maybe reclaim a little bit that forfeited agency So I don't know if anything I'm saying has sparked or if you'd like to
Oh,
respond to anything, but I just wanted to give you a sense of.
yes, I know. I think there are many ways in which what you say is really wonderful. One of the things that needs to happen to deal with climate change is that people need to move away from this very material culture that we have, where it's so important for us to buy things, own things, go places. And I think what you're talking about is that the way to do that is, as you say, to reconnect with people, that our relationships should come first. And the more that we do that and get satisfaction that way, the less we'll need to do all these other things that are so destructive to the earth. Be great if we could tell people, I know you think you need to fly to Africa for a vacation, but who are you going with? And how much conversation have you had with that person? And maybe you could not fly to Africa and save all that carbon dioxide emission and stay home and talk to the person that you were going to go with. So I think there's a lot to be said for reconnecting as one of the ways to do this. I'm actually a non-fundamentalist religious person, and there's a wonderful organization called Green Faith. I happen to be on the board of that, which has been mustering the faith-based organizations around the world, really, to be part of this. Whether one is religious or not, it is the case that many Americans do identify with religious organizations. And one of the ideas behind this organization is to try to get those religious leaders to take a stand with their congregations. In another area that we're very involved, which is vaccines, there was a terrible situation in Minnesota among Islamic Somali communities where they had been persuaded by anti-vaxxer types to not vaccinate their children, and were having all of these outbreaks of all kinds of communicable diseases. And the CDC kept going in there and lecturing them on, vaccines. And then somebody had the bright idea of getting together all the imams in that community and talking to them, and then having them go to the community. Now vaccination rates are back up to over 90%. There's no more measles, and people are doing better. So one of the things that we think may be a strategy, and that is actually successful, is to talk to those people. And by the way, another aspect of that is some of these organizations have tremendous endowments and pension funds, and we're having some success in getting them to agree to divest from the fossil fuel companies, because we do think that that's a strategy that will be helpful as people lower their stock, as their stock prices go down because people divest. But we're hoping that that will put pressure on these companies to change their ways. So it's good to use spirituality as well in its many different ways, both organized religion and even outside of organized religion, to try to make people feel connected to each other and to the earth. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. You caught me on a bad day, because I've just these past 3-4 days in particular, I'm researching a second book and a companion workbook, and the articles that I've been touching in with in these past few days are particularly, I'm struck by, it's bad enough how disconnected we obviously are in the USA, in particular, just between individuals and communities or tribes. But the degree to which we're disconnected from the earth there are times when it's just breathtaking. And I'm curious, Jack, I don't know how closely you follow some of the the destruction of habitat or the extinction numbers in terms of various animals and so on, I'm trying to limit the number of data points that I include in this next book, because I put in far too much in the first book and got lots of counsel against that. But I'm finding that there are just 2 or 3 that that I just can't shake. And I'm wondering if you have that knowledge as well, and how you grapple with it, how you hold it. And let me just mention the ones I'm thinking of at the moment. And so one of them is often called the insect apocalypse. Mm-hmm. So the upwards of 3/4 or more of insect populations, depending on where we're talking about, but it's pretty strongly 3/4 of flying insects in particular, just by biomass measurements alone, are gone. Another breathtaking one is the tropical rainforests of the world have recently been discovered to have gone from carbon sinks to carbon producers, net carbon producers. And the last one in this top 3 is, we've lost 50% of the phytoplankton on
yes.
the planet. And in addition to it being elemental to the oceans, just it is the bottom of the food chain and this
right.
base. It also provides upwards of 50% of the oxygen for the rest of us on the planet as well. So I don't need anything more than those, and I don't think, they're not particularly climate related necessarily. And I'm wondering, do you mind sharing a little bit about how you hold whatever it is that's hard on your heart? That I was just sharing what's hard on my heart, what I have a difficult time just being present to on the average day. And I'm wondering if you have similar kind of metrics that you're aware of, and how do you?
Certainly, I mean, those 3 I am certainly aware of, and they do have to do with climate in many ways, particularly the loss of the tropical rainforest, as you know, and also the phytoplankton. I have a friend who's a scientist in that area and studies phytoplankton, and those 2 not only provide oxygen, but, as you know, absorb tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide, and just making the situation worse. I actually got interested in tigers, of all things, several years ago, and through the World Wildlife Conservation Organization. I'm not sure exactly why tigers interest me, but that's another example of an animal that was almost extinct because of cutting down their habitat. Those things are all awful. And of course, another thing that just makes me feel outraged and also horrible is the fact that the very people who contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions are the people who are most affected by climate change. Mm-hmm. And I see these awful scenes of people in Africa and on islands, and who are not driving cars around, but who are being destroyed by floods and heat waves and things like that really Americans are causing, and that makes me feel responsible. When I think of the fact that we are heating up the planet to the point where people in Africa who rely on growing crops that are now being wilted because of the heat, it's hard to not feel like I'm responsible for that. Every time I get in my car and drive it around, I'm responsible for that. The problem is that for a lot of people, and this is very sad, those things seem very remote. And you are absolutely right that we've lost 3/4 of the insects and phytoplankton and tropical rainforests. And I can talk on and on about people in Asia and the Middle East who are suffering, and, you know, nobody deserves to suffer with climate change, but those people are not even responsible for it, and they're suffering. And I find that it's easy for people to put those things out of their minds because they're not right in front of them. And I don't think that's a good thing at all. But I think that does happen. And so we have to, and I haven't actually thought about this so much, but I think it's a very good point. We have to try to see how we can get everybody to connect to their local area of the earth. And maybe not so easy for those of us who live in New York City. We tend to think that, you know, we're disconnected from nature because we don't have so much of it. But in fact, we have quite a bit. We live on an island here in New York City with rivers around us. One of the things that we've been trying to point out to people is that the Hudson River was once one of the most polluted rivers in the world. And we've actually been very successful in cleaning that river up. And we like to point that out because very rarely do we tell people about the successes that we've had in climate. That's an example. There are now fish that you can now go fishing in the Hudson River. You can fall in the Hudson River if you go on a boat and not get typhoid fever from it because we cleaned it up. So I think it's a very good point that we need to really emphasize to people what are the trees and the grasses and the animals that are right there in front of them that we're going to lose if we don't take this much more seriously.
Yeah. To sort of answer my own question a little bit, there's some things that I do that I just really appreciate having them passed on to me as practices that can help. Probably the deepest and broadest of them all is to take on really reach for a facility with grief, to create a relationship with grief like it's a normal part of life, like it's actually part of I think I brought up the word earlier about hygiene, you know, like literally it's a part of a psychic or a energetic or an existential hygiene to have a relationship with and a facility with grief. And my experience of that is that it is remarkably cleansing. Really is. Hygiene is probably more appropriate than I thought as a word. It's something that I know if I'm feeling the elements inside of myself that I now know means I'm grieving. This is hitting my hard heart. Hard. That I now have both individual solo practices around grief, and I also lead grief rituals to bring people together so that we can grieve together. Whatever, you know, each person brings is obviously unique. And every time I'm involved with those kind of rituals, I can now predict far more access to an expansiveness that might just bump itself out to the level of the grace that I was talking about before. And I noticed that without it, when I balk or when I don't do those practices, those rituals, life gets pretty shut down pretty quickly. You know, it becomes really easy to understand why the average person who has none of that in their life will tend to freeze at a very small provocation, really.
Right. So you've really developed a wonderful way to overcome fear at a personal level and to be able to press on, which I think is just fabulous.
Yeah, just working on the practices, you know.
Wonderful.
I can't see a more important thing to be doing right now
Yes.
than for us to find how, you know, kind of self-assess, how separate am I? How disconnected am I from
Yeah.
the primary sources of meaning in human life, and get on with reconnecting.
Yes.
And I also, I think it was in your article, is Auden Schendler and Andrew Jones. It was a great article, and I appreciated you including that. And obviously anybody who's watching the podcast will have that opportunity to go to your article and then go to theirs, and really beautiful words on their part. It seems like one of the advanced skills that if somebody's on this track that certainly I'm promoting in this body of work is to, I guess number one is to find your people. I keep
Yes.
saying that, find
Yes.
your people.
Yes. Yes.
And it's that advanced skill I'm trying to point at. I don't know what else to call it, but the ability to let go.
Mm.
And one of the easier ways to describe that, from the way I'm talking about it, is it seems ironically empowering to me to let go of outcome intent, or the intent, you know, our culture's built on outcome. Everybody's pushing for that outcome, going to be better, going to go for it, going to make the plan, going to hit the target,
Right.
and on and on. You know, that's just the entirety of the business as usual environment is built on that. And I'd like to assert that at the core of self-regulation at the level you and I are talking about is the ability to let go of that at will.
Yes.
Does that spark you to say anything?
No, you know, I think it's absolutely true that to let go of all of these preoccupations with the very things that are harming us with outcome, which is really making us blind to the connections that are both meaningful and spiritual. And, you know, that's how I think we got ourselves in this fix in the first place. I
Yeah.
see very often, for example, that it's very interesting. There's a tremendous push for all students to go into one of the so-called STEM fields these days,
Mm-hmm.
which is science, technology, engineering, and math. Obviously, I spent my entire life as a scientist, and I have a great deal of respect for science. But that really bothers me, because the reason why those people are being told to do that is because that's where the jobs are. That's where you can make the most money. And not necessarily go into fields that interest you, that you love, that are meaningful to you, that maybe it's going to be history or English or anthropology. I think it's one of the very many signs of how we're going wrong and moving in a wrong direction. And with my own grandchildren now, I hope that I can encourage them to do what they love. And I think that when people do that, they'll be less likely to want to destroy the world.
Yeah, well said. You know, Jack, we're just starting to nudge into the last few minutes here together, and I'm wondering if um, if this were a far larger venue, if I had a far larger audience, let's say a, you know, CNN or a BBC or something, and if you had a couple of minutes of airtime to really speak to people from what you know, and both personally
Yes.
and then also professionally,
Yes.
and if you knew they were a willing and appreciative audience,
Right.
what might you offer?
Well, I tell you, I'm going to start out by telling you what I would not do. And what I would not do is be like the typical scientist and recite a lot of data. You and I take it for granted that climate change is occurring, and we could go on and on giving a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I would emphasize is I would say to people, I know how you feel. This is really hard stuff. And you have a lot on your mind. You're trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to get your children from one place to the next. And it really is awful to be told that the world is going to come to an end if you don't change almost every aspect of your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we can't get away from that fact. So let's think about how we can incorporate into your life some consideration of how you can protect yourself and your family and do the right thing. I would try to make it personal that way and try to speak to what the person's goals are. Everybody wants to do the right thing for their family, for example. That's how we approach the vaccine issue. Instead of telling people, you know, if you don't vaccinate your children, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Our approach is to say, we understand you want to do the best thing for your children, and you've gotten worried that maybe vaccinations aren't the best thing. So let's talk about that. But we have that in common, that the most important thing is to do the right thing for our families and for our children. So I would try to make it personal in that way, not preaching to people, and try to bring it home to them. That's how I would do it. And I love your injection of connection and spiritual meaning into all of this. I think that's the only way we're going to get people on board. We're not going to do it by scaring them or by trying to cram their heads full of climate data.
Got it.
And I do hope you make it to CNN, because I think you have a wonderful message to impart.
I'm not holding my breath, but thank you for the encouragement. Jack, is there any way that somebody who would like to know more about what you do, what your daughter does, evidently you've got some sort of organization going on. Can you tell us just a little bit about that and how people can read more of your writing and
Sure.
experience more of your work?
Sure. Well, thank you for asking us. After Sarah and I wrote the book together, Denying to the Grave, a number of people said, well, what are you going to do about all this? And so we started a nonprofit company called Critica, which is our tool for trying to work on helping people to be able to accept scientific evidence. And you can go on our website, which is www.critica.life. And we have a series of essays that we all write, like the one that you saw in Psychology Today, about many different topics like this, involving science literacy and acceptance of evidence. And we'd love to have people go on there, sign up for our newsletter, and enter into a dialogue with us. And we're very open to having people tell us we are wrong. In fact, in an earlier version of the essay that you saw, somebody pointed out an error that I made, and we were able to correct it. That's another nice thing about online communication. It's easy to correct.
Jack Gorman, it's just been a pleasure. And I, again, just want to underscore, I don't take these podcast interviews lightly. I don't take this whole body of work lightly, although it's fun to get some laughs, and there's gallows humor
Right.
out the wazoo here. But I just want to say one more time how much I appreciate you are, for me, unfortunately, a rare bird. You are someone, you and your daughter are rare people who have the level of expertise that you do in the behavioral and mental health fields, and you're addressing far more of a sober reality and a sober framing of our world than most. And I thank you for that, because I think it's desperately needed. And I so appreciate the article, which again, I'll be putting in the show notes in the YouTube video. And I also will be picking up your book. I can't wait to read that. And just thank you so much for your work and for your obvious care.
Well, thank you so much for having me on here. Sarah wishes you all the best as well. And I also, we're great admirers of your work too, and wish you all the best.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.